Meredith Carter had always believed that some nights simply felt different, as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to go wrong, and that night in Chicago was shivering with that kind of tension, sticky with rain, humming with the distant electricity of sirens and secrets, and she felt it long before the call even came through the radio, before dispatch even spoke her name, before her partner raised an eyebrow and muttered, "Got a bad feeling about this one." And she didn't know why, but her heartbeat stuttered as if her instincts already knew they were being pulled into something that shouldn't be touched, something dangerous, something that would change everything, though she had no way of knowing her life was about to collide with the woman who ran Chicago's darkest shadows. By the time the siren of Ambulance 42 sliced through the damp night, Meredith had already shredded open a sterile kit bag, snapping on gloves with more tension than usual, her brown eyes sharp, focused, determined, her ponytail tight, her breath steady, because no matter where they were sent, no matter who was bleeding, she had one rule: save first, question later, and if she ever broke that rule, she wouldn't be who she was anymore. They reached the address, a location that didn't make sense, a warehouse half swallowed by darkness, surrounded by silent black SUVs that unmistakably did not belong to any official responders, and Meredith felt something coil in her stomach, but she grabbed her equipment anyway, stepping out into the cold, her boots splashing through puddles, her jacket tight against the wind, and that uneasy feeling whispering warnings she chose to ignore, because someone needed help. The warehouse door was partially open, just enough to reveal a sliver of shadows and silhouettes, men who didn't look like witnesses or bystanders, men whose eyes were too still, too controlled, too ready for violence, and for a moment, Meredith considered hesitation, but then a voice from inside snapped sharply, "She's dying." And that was all she needed to hear. Inside, the metallic air stank of gunpowder and blood, heavy and raw, and Meredith froze just for a second when she saw her, the woman on the cold cement floor. Her body lay angled, one arm limp, the other smeared with blood, tattoos faintly visible beneath torn sleeves, her suit jacket soaked through, expensive, tailored, ruined, her skin pale, almost too pale, contrasting violently with the deep red pooling beneath her. She was beautiful in a terrifying, magnetic way, sharp jawline, high cheekbones, long black hair cascading like spilled ink, a thin scar cutting through her bottom lip, giving her a constantly mocking, dangerous-looking expression even while unconscious. At first, Meredith didn't recognize her. Not until her partner whispered her name in disbelief, and suddenly the air felt even thinner. Karina Rubloff, the Mafia queen, the ghost of Chicago, the ruthless ruler of half the city's underworld. The woman whispered about in alleys and in police reports and in courtrooms where she never appeared, a phantom cloaked in power and fear. Meredith's heart should have stopped, should have panicked, but instead, some stubborn spark in her flared with determination, because it didn't matter who this woman was, how feared she was, or how dangerous the men around her looked with their tense postures and guns partially concealed. It only mattered that Karina Rubloff was bleeding out, and Meredith had to stop it. She dropped to her knees, sliding in blood without care, checking vitals, assessing the wound. Gunshot, left abdomen, deep, possibly hemorrhaging internally, dangerously close to major organs, and Meredith barked orders with more authority than she realized she possessed, snapping at the men to bring more light, snapping at her partner for 4 fluids and compression dressings, and for the first time in her career, men with guns obeyed her, because she was the only person in that warehouse capable of even momentarily stopping death from taking the woman they clearly served. Meredith pressed down hard, too hard. Karina flinched, eyelids twitching, a soft groan escaping her lips, raw and vulnerable, so unlike the legend she was rumored to be, and Meredith couldn't help but stare at her face, pale but strong, framed by wet strands of black hair, her eyelashes dark, her expression pained, and maybe, just for a second, almost human. "Stay with me," Meredith whispered under her breath, surprising herself, because she had never whispered that before to a patient, but something about this woman, it felt like saving her meant something, something bigger than a name on a medical chart. Karina's eyes fluttered open, just barely, but in that flicker, Meredith saw stormy steel-gray eyes, sharp despite pain, unyielding despite injury, a gaze so intense that for a split second, Meredith forgot how to breathe. Karina stared at Meredith not like she was just a paramedic, not like she was a stranger, but like she had never seen someone like her before. "Don't let me die," Karina rasped, her voice low, ragged, but her words laced with something unfamiliar, something like trust, and Meredith didn't know why, but she answered softly, "I won't," as if she meant it with every piece of herself. The ride to the hospital was chaos, menacing black vehicles following closely, radios buzzing with encrypted codes and warnings, and Meredith worked tirelessly in the back, keeping pressure, monitoring vitals, fighting for Karina's life while their eyes met occasionally. Karina's cloudy with pain, Meredith's fierce with purpose, and somehow, in the dim flashing red lights bouncing off steel-gray eyes, something formed. Something strange and dangerous and unspoken. At the hospital, everything moved fast. Emergency trauma code, surgeons rushing, security losing their minds over who their patient was, federal agents appearing, but through all of it, Meredith stayed, her gloves soaked in the blood of the most feared woman in the city, her heartbeat thundering, not just from adrenaline, but from the feeling she couldn't explain, that tonight was just the beginning. Hours later, after surgery, after questions, after intimidation by stern men who clearly worked for her, Meredith sat in the dim ICU hallway, staring through the observation window at Karina Rubloff lying unconscious, alive but fragile, the glow of monitors reflecting off her scar, and Meredith felt something she shouldn't, curiosity, concern, and something deeper, warmer, unsettling. Because Meredith had seen things in Karina's eyes tonight. Fear, vulnerability, trust, that she wasn't supposed to see. Things that could ruin them both. She didn't know that Karina had asked, before anesthesia took hold, in a voice barely audible, her name. Find her name, meaning hers. She didn't know that Meredith's face was the last thing Karina saw before darkness. She didn't know that saving Karina Rubloff's life had just entangled her fate with one of the most dangerous women in Chicago. She only knew this. She would never forget those storm-gray eyes, or the way they looked at her like she was the only real thing in a world full of shadows. And deep down, she knew, with terrifying certainty, that this was not the last time their lives would collide. Meredith had never believed hospitals could feel too quiet, but that morning the silence felt different, dense, almost watchful, like the walls themselves were waiting for something to happen, and she didn't realize she had been standing outside the private ICU door for almost 5 full minutes until a nurse passed by and gave her a strange look, but she couldn't move, couldn't quite explain to herself why she felt this magnetic pull toward a room that held a woman she should forget a woman. She should never have crossed paths with, yet one who now existed in every corner of her thoughts, flashing like a warning and a promise. She tried to convince herself she was only here to check on a patient, that it was simple professional concern, but the tremor in her hand when she finally reached for the door handle betrayed her, and when she stepped inside, her heart was already racing for reasons that had nothing to do with medicine. Karina Rubloff was awake, sitting upright, weak but unforgivingly composed, pale skin against white sheets, one hand lightly touching the fresh bandage over her abdomen, her long black hair cascading over her shoulders like spilled ink, her jaw set with quiet authority even in vulnerability, and her storm-gray eyes, those same unforgettably intense eyes, lifted, slow and sharp, locking onto Meredith with such startling clarity that Meredith actually forgot to breathe for a second. It felt like the room tilted, like the air thinned, like something shifted. Karina didn't speak at first. She didn't thank her, didn't ask anything, didn't express confusion or pain or fear. She just studied Meredith, not with curiosity, but with unmistakable recognition, like she remembered not just a face but a feeling, like she remembered that moment in the ambulance when she had looked at her and felt something too. Meredith swallowed, stepping closer, trying to act like she wasn't drowning in that stare, and set down the chart with what she hoped looked like professional calm, even though her pulse was thundering through her veins. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her voice lower than usual, softer without intending to be, and Karina just blinked once, slow and deliberate, her eyes unblinking and terrifyingly observant. "Alive," she finally murmured, her voice hoarse but controlled, a voice that sounded like quiet thunder, like command disguised as grace. And then, after a silence that stretched too long, she added, "You did that." Meredith felt something flutter painfully in her chest, and she tried to smile, but it came out shaky and too human. "It's my job," she whispered, but even she didn't fully believe that, because it hadn't felt like just a job. Karina tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable, but there was something about the way she looked at Meredith, like she was trying to understand something that made no sense. "They said you didn't leave the hallway," Karina said. "They said you stayed." Meredith didn't know how to explain that either. She didn't know why she hadn't been able to walk away, why she had felt this strange magnetic tension pulling her back, something heavy and electric and inexplicable. So she said nothing. But silence was an answer, and Karina seemed to understand. There was a flicker, a flash of something softer, something almost like gratitude, almost like vulnerability, but it vanished just as quickly, replaced by that impenetrable coolness, that calm ruthlessness Meredith had heard rumors about. Before Meredith could decide what to say next, the door opened abruptly, and two men in tailored suits, the same kind of black-clad shadows she had seen in that warehouse, stepped in, scanning the room with tension that felt like a physical force. They looked at Meredith as if she didn't belong there, as if she had stepped inside a world that would not allow her to leave easily, and Meredith felt a chill crawl up her spine. But before she could even speak, Karina's voice cut through the air, low but sharp. "Out." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The men obeyed instantly. Meredith stared, stunned by the effortless authority. Karina's gaze drifted back to her, softer now, almost curious. "People don't look at me the way you do," she said, her voice quieter now, not weak, but thoughtful. "And yet you're not afraid." Meredith didn't know whether it was true. She didn't know if what she felt was fear or something more dangerous. Maybe both. But before she could answer, Karina said something that felt impossibly out of place for someone like her. "I don't remember your name," she whispered, and there was something oddly fragile in that admission, something that made Meredith's breath catch. She answered softly, "Meredith." Karina repeated it under her breath, once, like a secret, like something precious. Meredith had no idea why hearing her name spoken so quietly, so intently, by this woman sent a shiver down her spine, but it did. Moments passed, silent, tense, strangely intimate, and Meredith knew she should leave, that staying meant stepping deeper into something she couldn't control, something dark and consuming, but she couldn't quite force herself to go. Not when Karina was looking at her like that. And maybe Karina saw that hesitation because her expression shifted, less guarded now, less distant. "Stay," she said quietly, not as an order, not as a demand, but as something else, something almost like a plea, something that felt deeply human. And Meredith, who had spent her whole life saving people but never quite understood what it felt like to be seen, sat down. For the first time, Karina Rubloff, the Mafia queen, didn't look untouchable, didn't look terrifying, didn't look like a legend. She just looked like a woman who had been very close to dying and who wasn't used to anyone staying beside her. And something inside Meredith shifted dangerously, quietly, irrevocably. Hours passed. Words were few, but glances were long, heavy, filled with too many questions neither of them dared ask. Meredith eventually stood to leave, her hand brushing lightly against Karina's as she adjusted the foreline, and neither of them moved. Not for one long, breathless second. It was barely a touch. Love what you've seen so far, and want to help me keep creating these awesome stories on this channel? Then subscribe and hit the bell. Your subscription supports the channel and makes sure you get more exciting stories. Barely anything. But it felt like the start of something neither of them had planned for. Something neither of them knew how to stop. Meredith had always believed hospitals were safe places, protected by rules and clean lighting and the illusion that nothing truly bad could happen within their walls. But that illusion shattered the moment she noticed the two unfamiliar men positioned at the far end of the ICU floor, dressed in suits too sharp, standing too still, watching too closely, and she knew instantly they did not belong to any official department, and worse, did not belong anywhere near a recovering patient. She felt the shift in the air, a quiet danger, something unseen but undeniable, and her instincts screamed that the threat from that warehouse hadn't been left behind. It had followed them here, moving through the corridors like a silent storm. She stepped into Karina's room, trying to appear calm, but Karina's gray eyes flicked to her face immediately, reading her like she was made of glass, and Meredith didn't know how. But somehow the Mafia queen sensed it too, tension sliding into place like a hidden blade. Karina didn't ask what was wrong. She simply asked, too quietly, "Where?" And Meredith didn't even realize she had answered with her eyes, just a glance toward the hallway, but it was enough. Karina exhaled slowly, not with fear, but with calculation, already 3 steps ahead of a danger Meredith could only sense in fragments. 2 of her men entered seconds later, Grant and Victor, the same ones from the warehouse, lean and hard-eyed, wearing tension like armor, and behind them was a woman Meredith had never seen before, cold, composed, with hair slicked back and expression sharp enough to cut glass, and she spoke to Karina in Russian, low and fast, like the language itself was made of knives. Karina answered just as quietly, her voice like steel wrapped in silk, and Meredith couldn't understand the words, but she could feel the meaning. Threat, retaliation, danger closing in. Then, the woman in the suit looked at Meredith with an expression that wasn't entirely friendly or hostile, but assessing, like she was trying to measure whether Meredith was a liability or something else, something she hadn't expected. Meredith had never felt more out of place, standing there in scrubs and sneakers, holding a medical chart like it could anchor her to normalcy in a world rapidly ripping sideways. Karina seemed to notice the flicker of unease on Meredith's face, because her voice softened, not much, but just enough to feel different from the voice she used with her people. "You shouldn't be here right now," Karina said quietly, her storm gray eyes steady on Meredith's face, and it wasn't a dismissal but something else, something almost like concern, and that made Meredith's heart twist painfully in a way she wasn't prepared for. "I'm your paramedic," Meredith tried to argue, though she didn't quite know why, and Karina's lips twitched, the shadow of a bitter smile. "You saved my life," she said. "But that doesn't mean you should risk yours." Something in the way she said it made Meredith's breath catch, because it sounded personal, and too deliberate to be accidental. Her partner, Daniel, appeared at the door, his expression tight, voice low as he whispered, "It's not safe. We need to go. Something's happening downstairs. Armed men. Looks like they're asking for her by name." Her. Not Karina. Meredith. She felt the world tilt, the realization slamming into her. They weren't just after the Mafia queen. They were after the woman who had saved her. Because leaving her alive meant leaving a witness alive. Karina's gaze turned deadly. "They think she's leverage," Victor muttered darkly in Russian, and Karina's expression turned to ice, colder than the sterile hospital lights, colder than winter in the dead of night. She raised her head, and her voice, though quiet, held that unshakable, terrifying authority Meredith had seen in whispers and rumors about the Mafia queen. "Anyone who touches her will answer to me." It was not a threat. It was a verdict. Meredith felt the weight of those words down to her bones, not with fear, but with something else, something unreasonably warm considering the danger that crept just beyond the door. Karina looked at her again, but this time, the quiet in her eyes was not cold, not hard, but deliberate, protective. "Stay close," she said, softly now, almost like a secret. Within minutes, plans were moving, security tightening, arrangements made that Meredith could not understand but could feel shifting around her like invisible armor, protection she wasn't sure she wanted, but somehow felt strangely safer receiving. Daniel whispered frantically, "Mir, we should leave," but Meredith shook her head, unable to explain that leaving felt wrong, dangerous, not just for herself, but for some fragile, unnamed connection forming in that room, something she should have run from, but couldn't. Karina's hand brushed her wrist. Just a touch, nothing more. But the effect was staggering, grounding, electric, and for one heartbeat, time stilled, breath suspended between two worlds, one of safety and one where Meredith had willingly stepped too close to the flame. Hours passed in tension, whispers, and hushed movements, and Meredith stayed, sitting quietly by Karina's bed, while outside, layers of protection tightened like shadows folding inward. It should have felt terrifying, but instead, it felt like the most inevitable thing in the world. At one point, Karina fell asleep, her breathing slow but steady, her hand resting near Meredith's on the pillow, and Meredith let herself really look, at her, at the scar on her lip, the subtle tension in her brow, even in sleep, the strength she held even while vulnerable, something so deeply human that it stole Meredith's breath. It was terrifying how human she looked. Hours later, Karina stirred, eyes opening slowly, not with fear, but with recognition, and she studied Meredith for a long moment, expression unreadable. "You stayed," she said softly, not quite surprised, not quite relieved, but something in between. Meredith couldn't explain why she stayed. She just did. And for reasons neither of them could yet name, that fact mattered. More than it should. Far more than it should. Meredith never imagined what a safe house for someone like Karina Rubloff would look like, but she certainly hadn't expected this. Not a fortress bristling with guards and bulletproof glass, not cold steel and surveillance, but a secluded mansion just outside the city limits, hidden behind iron gates and ancient trees, overlooking the misty edge of Lake Michigan like it had been standing there for 100 forgotten years. And as they pulled up the gravel drive in the black SUV, something inside Meredith shifted, because for the first time since that night in the warehouse, the fear didn't feel as sharp, replaced instead by something strange, something like curiosity, something like being drawn toward a place that wasn't exactly safe, but felt undeniably magnetic. The house wasn't huge the way she expected, but elegant, old, and strangely peaceful. All muted stone and ivy climbing its walls, soft lights glowing from within, and even though there were security men outside, their presence felt more protective than threatening, and Meredith realized in a quiet, unsettling moment that she was no longer just a paramedic who had saved the wrong person. She was someone under that person's protection. Inside, it was quiet. Not the sterile quiet of the hospital, not the dangerous quiet of the warehouse, but something entirely different. The quiet of a place that saw secrets more than people, conversations held in silence, emotions caught in glances, and traces of warmth left behind after people left rooms they had barely touched. It felt lived in, human, unexpectedly soft. A place that didn't belong to the image of a brutal queen of the Mafia, but to a woman who was far more complicated than a headline or a whispered name. When Karina entered, supported on one side by Victor, her face pale but unwavering, the house seemed to take a breath, as if it recognized its owner. She dismissed everyone but Meredith with a simple look, even though she said nothing, and her men obeyed like the air bent to her will. And suddenly, it was just the two of them, alone in a room that didn't feel dangerous, just strangely and heavily quiet. Meredith helped her settle onto a long, dark velvet couch in a lounge near the large windows, warm firelight flickering against Karina's pale skin and highlighting the faint scar at her lip, the one that Meredith found herself looking at more often than she should. Karina did not speak. She didn't thank her or ask why she had agreed to come. She simply watched her, eyes soft and exhausted, but alert, like she was studying someone who didn't quite make sense to her. Meredith set down the medical bag she had insisted on bringing, then sat across from her, unsure what to do with her hands, unsure what to do with her eyes, because Karina was staring at her again in that intense way that felt less like being looked at and more like being known, and Meredith was terrified of what she might see in return. The storm-gray eyes lingered on her face, her hands, the way her shoulders tensed as if she was trying to hold the world together by sheer will. Then, unexpectedly, Karina spoke, her voice softer than Meredith had ever heard it. "You look like you don't know whether to run or to stay." Meredith exhaled, a shaky, breathless sound she hadn't meant to let out, and she forced herself to hold Karina's gaze even though it felt like standing at the edge of something unknown. "I don't," she admitted, and the honesty made something flicker in Karina's expression, something unreadable but definitely real. "I don't think I belong here." Karina's eyes didn't waver. "And yet you're here." The silence that followed wasn't heavy or tense, but strangely full, like it carried things neither of them knew how to name yet. Outside, rain had begun to fall, soft and steady, tapping against the glass like a secret too gentle to disturb them, and Meredith found herself looking around the room again, trying to reconcile what she saw with what she thought she knew about this woman. There were books, rows of books, old and worn, spines cracked, some in English, some in Russian, some in languages Meredith didn't recognize. Art on the walls, not expensive showpieces, but real art, textured and haunting, pieces that felt chosen rather than bought. And a piano in the corner, not polished, not staged, but slightly worn, with sheet music open and waiting, as if someone had been playing not too long ago. It didn't feel like a crime lord's safe house. It felt like someone's home. Meredith didn't know when she started looking at Karina differently, but she felt it happening, a shift from wariness to something stranger, deeper, something like seeing the woman instead of the myth, and it unsettled her more than any weapon could. Karina rested back against the couch, fatigue showing at last in the slump of her shoulders, and Meredith watched her. Watched the way she winced softly at the pain in her side, her bravado slipping just barely, and without thinking, without planning, she reached out, gently touching Karina's hand to steady her. The contact was brief, but it was enough. Karina's eyes snapped to hers, not with anger, not with confusion, but with something startlingly human, something Meredith had no name for yet, and neither of them moved, neither of them spoke, and the silence between them began to feel like its own language. "You didn't have to come," Karina murmured eventually, her voice lower now. "But you did." Meredith swallowed, her voice impossibly soft. "You didn't have to protect me, but you did." Something shifted then. Something silent, unbroken, but undeniably there. Karina held Meredith's gaze for a long moment, and in that moment, Meredith felt something she hadn't expected, something like safety, something like danger, something like being seen. Not by the legend, but by the woman. And that, somehow, was far more dangerous. Hours passed. The fire burned low. The storm outside deepened. And for the first time since meeting her, Meredith saw Karina not as a myth, not as a weapon disguised as a woman, but as a woman disguised as a weapon, someone who had built walls so high, so unshakable, that no one had tried to climb them in a very long time. And Meredith, who had never known how to walk away from something broken, realized with quiet fear that she did not want to leave. Maybe not ever. Meredith had been in Karina Rubloff's house for 3 days, long enough for the silence to stop feeling intimidating and start feeling strangely comforting, though she would never admit that out loud, and long enough to notice the little things most people never would. The way Karina always paused for exactly 1 second before answering questions, as if measuring which parts of herself to reveal. The way her footsteps were always quiet but never hesitant. The way she often stood by the tall glass windows even when there was nothing to look at but rain and mist, her reflection barely visible, as if she was studying a version of herself she no longer recognized. The mansion was quiet most of the time, guarded but not crowded, filled with light that filtered softly through large windows and landed on old wooden floors like golden whispers. The kitchen in the mornings smelled like coffee and something faintly earthy, like rosemary and pine, and even though Meredith had never seen Karina cook, she had noticed that she always made her own tea, steeped slowly in a dark ceramic cup, and she always wrapped both hands around it, like she needed the warmth more than she would ever show. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. And Meredith was learning that sometimes the quiet was more revealing than words could ever be. Victor and Grant were around, keeping distance but always watching, especially when Meredith and Karina were in the same room. Not with suspicion, but with quiet curiosity, as if they did not understand this thread forming between the two women but respected it nonetheless. The rest of the staff moved carefully, deliberately, with a kind of reverence Meredith couldn't explain. By afternoon, Karina could walk without help, though she moved carefully, pressing her hand lightly against her abdomen from time to time, and Meredith always noticed, even when she pretended not to. That evening, near golden hour light, Meredith found herself in the quiet reading lounge again, sitting cross-legged on the dark velvet couch with a medical file open under the pretense of work, though she had been reading the same paragraph for half an hour. Karina was near the window, wearing soft black loungewear instead of tailored suits, hair pulled loosely over one shoulder, her scar visible, her profile sharp but softer now, not weapon-like, but something else, something almost vulnerable. She wasn't looking at Meredith, but Meredith felt watched anyway, not in a protective or threatening way, but in a way that felt like being seen, deeply seen, more than she wanted to be. It made something in her chest tighten, not with fear, but with something unsteady, something that felt dangerously like longing. "You don't belong in my world," Karina said quietly, still not looking at her, just watching the fading light over the lake, and Meredith blinked, because it was not an accusation, not a dismissal, but something else. "I know," Meredith whispered, surprised by how steady her voice sounded, though her heartbeat wasn't. Karina didn't turn. "But you're here anyway." Meredith didn't know what to say to that, not when it felt true in a way she didn't know how to navigate. She hadn't meant to stay this long. She hadn't meant to feel, whatever this was. Safety? Danger? Peace? Confusion? She stood, closing the file, feeling that invisible thread that always seemed to pull her toward Karina tighten again, slowly, silently, and she found herself walking toward her, until they were close enough that she could hear the soft rhythm of Karina's breathing. "Are you going to ask me to leave?" Meredith asked quietly, not sure if she wanted the answer to be yes or no. Karina's eyes flicked to her then, intense, storm gray, unreadable. "No," she said simply, and it felt like the most significant answer she had ever heard. That night, the storm returned. Rain lashed against the windows, wind whispered through the trees, and somewhere in the house, a piano played, soft, haunting, delicate, a melody too careful to be random, too emotional to be just practice. Meredith froze in the corridor outside her guest room, listening, heart-thudding, because the melody was not perfect like a rehearsed performance, but human, flawed, searching. She followed it. Downstairs, in the dim amber light of the music room, she saw her. Karina, sitting at the piano. Barefoot, hair down, not elegant, not dangerous, just human. She didn't see Meredith at first. Her fingers moved slowly over the keys, hesitantly, then confidently, then hesitantly again, like someone rediscovering an old language they had once been fluent in. And there, in that moment, Meredith saw it. Not the Mafia queen, not the legend of fear and control, but the woman beneath. Real. Beautiful. Lonely. When the song ended, Karina didn't move, her fingers resting lightly on the keys, her breath barely audible, and Meredith stepped inside softly, unwilling to break the moment, but unable to walk away. She sat on the piano bench beside her. Neither of them spoke at first because words felt wrong in a moment like this. The only sound was rain. The only light was warm and dim. And in the silence, something shifted, something soft, something dangerous, something that could not be undone. "When I was a child," Karina said at last, so quietly it felt like a confession, "I used to think that people who played music could not be truly cruel." Meredith looked at her, heart aching. "Were you right?" A long pause. Karina exhaled. No, silence. Breathing. Warm light. Meredith's voice barely a whisper. "Then why do you still play?" Karina turned, for once not hiding anything. To remember that I wasn't always this person. The vulnerability in her voice felt like a crack in armor, something fragile and fleeting, and Meredith felt something in her chest break open, something like empathy, something like connection, something like falling. She didn't plan what happened next. She didn't think. She just moved, closer, slow, cautious, her hand hovering near Karina's, and she watched carefully, ready to pull back, ready to apologize, until Karina didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hand and let their fingers brush, just a touch, soft, trembling, but intentional. It felt like electricity. It felt like gravity. It felt like something inevitable. Slowly, like the world was holding its breath, Karina looked at her, not with fear, not with confusion, but with something deep, something unspoken, something that felt like surrender. Meredith's pulse thundered. She leaned in just slightly, just enough that Karina could stop her, walk away, change everything, but she didn't. Karina did not retreat. She did not hesitate. She didn't hide. She simply closed the space between them with a soft, breathless, unguarded kiss, fragile, slow, unplanned, like something blooming in the dark, something delicate and real. It didn't last long. It wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. It was real. When they pulled back, they didn't speak, because words would have ruined it. They just breathed. Rain falling outside. Piano silent. Breath warm between them. And something had unmistakably changed. Forever. Karina didn't sleep that night, though the rain softened and the fire eventually died down, leaving the music room quiet and shadowed and strangely still, like it was holding on to something that had just happened, something fragile and irreversible, something that neither of them had the courage to name. Meredith didn't sleep much either. She lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, feeling the echo of Karina's touch on her fingertips, on her cheek, on her lips, soft and hesitant and unguarded in a way that felt almost impossible for someone like her. Something had shifted. Something had changed. But morning came anyway, pale and cold, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. Karina was already up when Meredith stepped quietly into the kitchen, wearing a long black sweater, hair loosely gathered, expression unreadable but calmer than usual, maybe softer, though Meredith couldn't be sure. She didn't look at Meredith right away, just poured tea into a dark ceramic cup and then paused, just barely, before pouring a second one and setting it gently at the opposite end of the kitchen island, without a word. Meredith sat. Their eyes met for a fraction of a moment, quiet but electric, full of unspoken memory, but Karina didn't mention what had happened the night before, and Meredith didn't push it, even though every heartbeat whispered it had meant something, something real. The silence was not cold. It was protective, careful, almost tender. But it was also fragile because it didn't quite know what it was yet. Throughout the day, Meredith began to see how Karina handled the world around her. She issued instructions quietly but decisively, rarely raised her voice, rarely showed emotion, but people obeyed her the way trees obeyed wind, natural and inevitable, as if it wasn't just authority but certainty, something deeper, something born from surviving rather than commanding. But sometimes, when she passed by Meredith, her gaze would flicker, softer, unreadable, human. She didn't speak of it, but she didn't ignore it either. That evening, Victor arrived with news. Meredith wasn't meant to hear, but she did. A rival group had been moving, watching hospitals, tracing ambulance reports, searching for someone. Not Karina. Meredith. Because now they knew who saved the Queen. They thought she mattered. They were right. Karina's posture changed instantly, spine straightening, voice turning colder, sharper, more dangerous. But it wasn't fear Meredith saw in her eyes when she looked at her. It was something far worse. Something that felt like guilt. That afternoon, the house felt different. More guarded. Doors that had been left ajar were now closed. Conversations that had been quiet were now silent. Karina avoided her, not with distance, but with restraint, as if staying too close would burn something neither of them were ready to feel. In the hallway outside her office, Meredith stopped her without knowing why. She didn't touch her this time. She just stood there, heartbeat too loud. "You're avoiding me," she said, barely audible. Karina didn't deny it. She stood still, hands clasped behind her back, eyes not meeting hers. "Things are complicated," she said softly, and it was the closest she had come to vulnerability since their kiss. Meredith exhaled, frustration and confusion colliding. "Last night happened," she said, Not accusing, not pleading, just telling the truth. Karina finally looked up. Her eyes, stormy, conflicted, piercing, held hers with unnerving honesty. Yes, she said. It happened. Silence. Thick. Heavy. Breathless. And it can't happen again. It felt like a bruise. Meredith didn't know why it hurt, but it did. Deeply. Why? She whispered. Karina closed her eyes. Just for one moment. Because people like me don't get to keep things like you. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was raw. Meredith wanted to argue, wanted to ask what that meant, wanted to understand what Karina was so afraid of, but the look on her face stopped her. There was fear there, not of enemies or death or pain, but of feeling. Later that night, Meredith sat by the window in her room, curtains partly open, heart heavy, mind tangled. The garden outside was quiet, moonlight glinting off wet stone pathways and dark trees, and for the first time since she had arrived, the house felt too big, too empty, too quiet. A light flickered downstairs. Soft footsteps. A silhouette. Karina. Alone. Standing by the piano again. But she didn't play. Meredith didn't disturb her. She just watched, silent, invisible, as Karina stood there motionless, hands hovering above the keys but never touching, as if afraid that music might make her feel too much. Meredith whispered into the quiet, even though Karina couldn't hear her. You're not alone. Not anymore. The next day, things didn't get easier. But something changed. Karina didn't avoid her completely. She left the kitchen door open. She passed by the lounge slower than necessary. She brushed her hand against Meredith's once in a hallway, not by accident. And one night, when thunder rolled across the lake and wind crept along the windows, Karina finally spoke without walls. I've been shot 3 times, she said quietly, not looking at her. Stabbed twice. I've buried people. Protected others. I've held dying men while they begged me to tell their children they loved them. Meredith didn't breathe. And none of that scared me. Silence. A heartbeat. A breath. But you do. Karina didn't look away. And for the first time, Meredith saw it clearly. Power didn't make Karina Rubloff untouchable. Feeling did. And feeling was far more dangerous. Meredith never thought she would find herself standing in the center of a dimly lit training room inside the home of the most feared woman in Chicago. But there she was, wearing fitted athletic clothes Victor had wordlessly handed her that morning, staring at a row of practice mats and wondering how her life had gone from paramedic to protected asset in less than a week. She stood awkwardly at first, shifting her weight, feeling small under the stillness of the space, until Victor stepped in, calm as always, arms crossed, expression unreadable. He didn't explain much, just looked at her steadily and said, "You're here because someone wants to hurt you. We intend to make that as difficult as possible." And then training began, not aggressive, not harsh, but precise, built from awareness, balance, breath, teaching her where her weaknesses were and how to stop them from being used against her. Meredith wasn't fast, but she learned quickly, focused fiercely, her determination sharper than her body's abilities, and Victor, who rarely praised anyone, simply nodded once and said, "You think well when frightened. Keep that." Karina watched from the doorway. She didn't speak. She didn't enter. She just watched, silently, eyes unreadable, arms folded lightly, and there was something in her gaze Meredith couldn't decipher, something between pride and reluctance, like she wanted to look away but couldn't. That night, Meredith found bandages on her dresser, before she even asked. Medical supplies. Ointment. A folded note. "You're not as breakable as you think." No signature. But she knew. The days unfolded differently now. Training in the mornings. Silence in the hallways. Tea left for her on the kitchen counter, without anyone admitting who made it. Conversations in passing, not about emotions, not about what had happened between them, but about strategy, safety, observation, caution, and yet, beneath those conversations, something deeper pulsed, unspoken but felt, a kind of emotional echo, like every moment was stitched with invisible threads pulling them closer despite everything. Karina didn't avoid her the way she had before. Not physically. But she guarded herself, carefully, as if every word and glance had to be measured, controlled, rationed. Yet late at night, Meredith would walk past the piano room and see her there, always standing just near it, never playing, hands hovering over the keys but never touching, like the music lived in her still but she didn't trust it anymore. One evening, Meredith broke the unspoken rule of silence. She spoke first. "You're afraid of it," she said softly, not stepping inside the room but not leaving either. Karina didn't turn. "I'm not afraid of anything," she replied quietly, but there was no force behind her voice. Meredith took a step closer, careful, steady. Not of enemies, not of pain, but of feeling. Silence. A long one. Meredith thought she would get no answer. But then Karina exhaled. "Feelings get people killed," she said, but her voice was softer, fragile in a way that felt rare. Meredith looked at her, not with pity, but with understanding. "Not feeling gets people emptier." Karina did not reply. But she didn't walk away either. One morning, training turned into something different. Victor had stepped out, and Karina herself stood across from Meredith, barefoot on the mat, wearing gray training clothes instead of dark tailored suits, her hair pulled back loosely, her expression almost unreadable. "Again," she said quietly, and Meredith nodded, trying to focus, stepping in, moving slow, learning how to shift weight, how to react, how to anticipate. Karina didn't hit. She guided. Hands around Meredith's wrist, not tight, just firm. Soft instruction. "Lower your shoulder. Watch the hips. Where the eyes go, the body follows." There were no walls between them in those moments, no titles, no myths, no fear. Just guidance. Breath. Presence. And something unspoken but pulse deep, alive, and impossible to ignore. When she corrected Meredith's stance, her hand rested too long on her arm. Neither of them mentioned it. That afternoon, Meredith found herself sitting in the study room with Karina, not because they planned to, but because they happened to, silently sharing the same space. Meredith pretending to read a file. Karina reviewing coded documents and maps. But there was something about the quiet that felt strangely comfortable now. Like it wasn't the lack of conversation that defined it. It was the knowledge that words weren't needed. There were moments when Karina would look up, as if sensing pain or worry even before Meredith spoke, and then she would simply stay, silent but undeniably present. And Meredith realized something then. Protection wasn't just guards, weapons, or hidden safe houses. Protection could also be presence. And Karina protected her more by being there than by any security measure. That evening, everything shifted again. Victor approached with new information. A threat had escalated. There had been movement near Meredith's former apartment. Someone had tried to bribe a coworker. Someone was looking for the paramedic. Karina's face hardened, not with fear, but with fury. But beneath it, something deeper. Meredith saw it. Not anger for herself, but anger because someone had tried to reach Meredith. And that, for Karina, was unacceptable. Hours later, the house was quiet again. Meredith was sitting by the fireplace, lost in thought, unsure how to feel about being hunted for saving a life that never should have crossed hers. And then, without a word, Karina sat across from her. No walls. No distance. Just closeness. Not touching, but close enough to feel. "They won't touch you," Karina said softly, looking at the fire instead of her. "They won't get near you." Meredith didn't answer, but she watched her quietly for a very long time, and something settled in the air between them. Not a confession, not a declaration, but a promise. One made without words, without strategy. One made by simply staying. And in that moment, Meredith understood something. Karina didn't just protect her because she felt responsible. She protected her because she cared, whether she liked that truth or not. Meredith had grown used to the uneasy peace of Karina's mansion, a place where silence felt like armor and where protection came in the form of watchful eyes, encrypted radios, and quiet shadows moving at the edge of corridors. But peace, even disguised as tension, had a rhythm, and that rhythm shattered the moment she stepped outside the house alone for the first time in days. It had been Karina's idea, ironically enough, not to leave completely but to get fresh air on the terrace, to walk along the inner garden path, just for a moment, under the pale morning light that made the air look softer than it felt. 2 guards accompanied her, not close enough to feel suffocating but close enough to feel watched, and Meredith tried not to mind, tried to breathe, tried to pretend she wasn't waiting for something to go wrong. It happened faster than she could process. The gravel crunched differently beneath someone's steps. The first clue. The guard on her left stiffened. The second. The wind shifted, carrying sound from beyond the back gate. Sharp, fast, wrong. The third clue was the gunshot. Meredith didn't see the shooter. She didn't register the scream. She didn't even feel the impact. Only the way someone yanked her down behind a stone barrier, the sound of splintering rock exploding near her head, the echo of more shots. Closer now, faster, too many, too close. She hit the ground, breath gone, ears ringing, heart slamming violently against her ribs. She heard shouting, radios, the thud of running feet, the metallic click of weapons being drawn, orders shouted in Russian and English, but all she could think was this isn't supposed to happen here, not inside Karina's world, not where she was supposed to be safe. Someone screamed her name. Not the guards. Not Victor. Not Grant. A different voice. A voice she knew. Karina. Meredith barely had time to turn before Karina was beside her, moving with terrifying precision, crouching, eyes wild in a way Meredith had never seen, sharp, frantic, unguarded, human, terrifyingly human, and for a second, everything else vanished. Are you hit? Karina's voice was too loud, too raw, her hands on Meredith's arms, on her face, searching, trembling, though her body remained impossibly still. Meredith shook her head. She thought so, maybe. She couldn't speak. She didn't think she was bleeding. She couldn't tell. Her heartbeat drowned everything. The guards formed a shield around them, Victor barking orders into a calm, eyes scanning the tree line like he could kill with a stare alone. But Karina didn't look away from Meredith. She didn't even blink. She touched her again, gentle, too gentle for a woman who commanded empires, her fingers brushing Meredith's wrist, her cheek, her hair, like she was checking if she was real. Not injured, not dead, still here. And something in her gaze broke, not with fear of death, but fear of loss. I told him to stay back, Karina whispered, voice tight, too tight, trembling without shaking, and Meredith realized she wasn't trembling from fear of the attack. She was trembling because Meredith had been outside, without her. They thought it was safe. Victor heard her and responded in clipped tones. It was safe. Until it wasn't. Meredith barely processed the rest. She only felt Karina's hand still on her cheek, her thumb still shaking slightly as it brushed just under her eye, like she needed to feel her breathing to believe she was alive. The shooting had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. Thick, jagged, full of unspoken horror. Karina stood, pulling Meredith up gently, slowly, staying close, too close, her hand gripping Meredith's arm like an anchor, like restraint, like something she could not afford to lose. They moved inside. The house felt different. Heavy, unmasked, on edge. Karina didn't speak to anyone. She simply walked Meredith past security, past staff, past doors that murmured with whispers and urgency, all the way to her private office, the one few were allowed in, and closed the door sharply, the sound echoing with finality. Meredith stood there, still shaking, adrenaline crashing dangerously fast, and when she looked up, she froze. Because Karina Rubloff, the woman who never showed weakness, who stood against enemies without blinking, was standing in the center of the room, silent, breathing hard, eyes dark with something fierce, something wild. Not fury, not violence. Something far more dangerous. They weren't after me, Karina said, voice barely audible. Not this time. Meredith swallowed. They were after you. Karina didn't say it angrily. She didn't say it like a confession. She said it like a realization, like a punishment, like a failure. She stared at Meredith, and for the first time, she didn't hide how much it scared her. "They don't threaten me by targeting my money," Karina said quietly. "Or my reputation. Or my power." Her voice broke. "Just barely. They threaten me by targeting what I can't replace." The silence was too loud. Meredith couldn't move, could barely breathe. Because Karina had just said more with one sentence than she had said in days, with 1,000 glances. Karina stepped closer then, not slowly, not carefully, but with urgency, stopping just inches away, close enough that Meredith could see every fragile detail in her eyes that no one else was allowed to see. Fear, yes, but also something deeper, rawer, something terrifyingly close to devotion. "I can fight enemies," Karina whispered. "I can fight wars. But I don't know how to fight this." Meredith didn't ask what this was. She already knew. It wasn't danger. It wasn't fear. It wasn't vulnerability. It was the fact that Karina Rubloff, the woman who built an empire on untouchability, now had something to lose. Someone. Meredith didn't touch her. She didn't have to. The closeness said what neither dared to speak. They remained there, breathing the same controlled, trembling breath, while outside, security forces scrambled, plans tightened, threats hunted. But inside this one quiet room, something had changed. Meredith was no longer just the paramedic who saved Karina's life. She was the one person who could break it. And, impossibly, Karina was letting her. Karina had always believed that silence was armor, that control was protection, that distance was survival, but after the attack, something shifted permanently, and she stopped pretending that Meredith was just someone she was responsible for. Now she was someone whose presence changed the temperature of rooms, someone whose absence made the air feel thin, someone whose safety felt personal, irreversible, dangerous in a way no enemy ever had. After that day, Meredith was no longer treated like a guest. She was no longer a protected outsider. She was part of Karina's inner circle, a small, tightly bound group of people who didn't serve her out of fear or loyalty, but out of something deeper, something from which Meredith was no longer excluded. Victor addressed her differently now, with a kind of professional respect that came from knowledge rather than assumption. Grant no longer hovered like a bodyguard in the periphery, but walked beside her, explaining quietly how the house's security systems worked and how to tell friend from danger. Even the silent kitchen staff watched her differently, not with suspicion, but with recognition. She mattered now, and that changed everything. But no one's behavior changed more than Karina's. Not outwardly. She was still composed, firm, controlled, never raising her voice, never showing fear or uncertainty in front of others. But when they were alone, when the door clicked shut and stopped the world from seeing, she was different. Not weaker, not softer, just real. A version of herself no one else saw, except Meredith. Their conversations deepened, not flirtation, not romantic confession, but something far more intimate. Revelation. Not of feelings, but of selves. One evening, when the storm clouds returned, low and heavy over Lake Michigan, Karina led Meredith not to the music room or the study, but somewhere new. A small attic library with low sloping ceilings, filled with old books, photographs, pieces of music, scratched maps, stacks of journals, and one large window overlooking the dark lake below. No one else entered this room. Meredith could tell before Karina even spoke. "I don't bring people here," Karina said simply, her voice quiet, not fragile but deliberate. "This is not where I plan, or negotiate, or command. This is just mine." Meredith didn't speak. She knew better than to break something sacred with casual words. Karina didn't sit at first. She moved slowly through the space, brushing her fingers across a stack of old sheet music, across a photograph in black and white, too faded to see clearly, then paused by the piano bench, the one that didn't match anything else in the room, as if it had been brought here later, a fragment of emotion placed where it didn't belong but somehow made sense. "My mother used to play," Karina said quietly, her back to Meredith now. She said music made people honest. that you couldn't lie when you were really listening. Meredith didn't move. She just listened. Karina turned the photograph around. It showed a woman, dark hair, storm gray eyes, standing by a piano, smiling a smile that didn't look rehearsed. Meredith looked at the photo, then at Karina. The resemblance was haunting. Did she teach you? Meredith asked softly. Karina nodded once, too slowly. She tried. Silence again. But not empty. Heavy. Meaningful. She died when I was 15, Karina said simply. Not dramatically. Not emotionally. Just truthfully. Meredith felt the air shift. After that, Karina continued, voice like soft glass. People expected me to inherit the empire. They thought I would be ruthless. They thought I would be like my father. And so I tried. Meredith's heartbeat thudded softly in her ears. And were you, she whispered. Karina met her gaze then, and for the first time, there was no mask, no shadow, no armor. Just a woman standing in a room full of ghosts. Most days, she said. I still am. The simplest words often hurt the most. Meredith took a step closer, not reaching out, not touching, just being present, close enough that her presence could be felt, not intruding, not rescuing, but witnessing. And sometimes, witnessing was its own kind of protection. And the music? Meredith asked, eyes on the piano, on the photo, on Karina. I stopped playing, Karina said, voice barely audible. Because music doesn't let you hide. Silence. Heavy. Genuine. Meredith didn't tell her she should play again. She didn't tell her it would help. She didn't say anything gentle or prescriptive or falsely comforting. She simply said, you don't have to hide with me. And Karina looked at her then, a long, unguarded stare, and something in her expression shifted, something small but immense, something that looked like belief. They stayed in that room longer than expected, sometimes talking, sometimes not, but never leaving. Not because they had nowhere else to be, but because finally, here, neither of them felt like they needed to be anywhere else. Meredith asked about her father only once, and Karina didn't answer with details. She simply said, he built a fortress around me. My mother tried to build a window instead. I think I've been searching for the window ever since. Meredith didn't speak, but she knew. She knew why she had been brought here, why she had been allowed to stay, why she had been kissed, why she had been protected, even when it threatened everything. Because, somehow, impossibly, Meredith had become that window. And that terrified Karina more than any bullet. Later, as the storm began to fade, the house felt strangely quiet, as if it had become aware of something changing beneath its roof. Karina stood by the window, arms folded loosely, watching the clouds shift above the lake. They think strength is about being untouched, she said softly, not turning. They're wrong. Strength is deciding what is worth touching you and guarding it. Meredith did not move closer, but she didn't move away either. And Karina did not hide. Not anymore. The first time Meredith was allowed into Karina Rubloff's private war room, the atmosphere shifted, not because of her presence, but because everyone felt something was different about the woman at the head of the table, the one they had followed for years, feared for decades, revered like a legend, but somehow now looked at differently, carefully, like she was standing at the edge of a cliff she had willingly chosen, not because someone pushed her, but because she saw something worth crossing. To the other side. The room was quiet when she entered, not cold, not hostile, just heavy, like the air itself held its breath. Maps of Chicago spread across the table, red markers near docks and warehouses and South Side intersections, encrypted dossiers stacked like silent witnesses to a war that had been building long before Meredith ever met Karina, but now had changed shape, now had a heartbeat, now was personal. When Karina entered, the room didn't just look at her. They aligned themselves with her, not physically, but emotionally, as if their entire perception of her had been recalibrated. She didn't look at them. She looked at Meredith. Not for approval, not for strength, just for grounding. Silent, but undeniable. Victor explained the threat. A coordinated effort. The first attempt on Meredith had been bold, but sloppy, rushed, likely a test. The next wouldn't be. They would come quietly, invisibly, not as enemies with guns, but as shadows with intent. They wanted leverage. They wanted what made Karina different. They wanted Meredith because they saw what others now saw too. Meredith was no longer an outsider. She was the variable, the risk, the weakness. Or, as Victor said calmly, the one thing they know you will protect beyond logic. Not beyond logic, Karina had corrected quietly. Beyond calculation. Meredith felt those words like a bruise she didn't know how to treat. The meeting continued. Discussions of safe houses, information leaks, surveillance interference, alliances forming and breaking, but all the while, Meredith couldn't help noticing how the men and women in the room looked at Karina differently now. They didn't just listen to the orders of a mafia queen. They listened to a woman who had chosen to feel. And in their world, emotion was rarer than loyalty, riskier than betrayal, more dangerous than war. When Grant spoke, calm, methodical, experienced, he said something that shifted the temperature of the room. This isn't like the others. They're not trying to take your empire. They're trying to remake it. Karina didn't flinch, but her jaw tightened, just slightly. They think mercy is weakness, she murmured. They think if I protect someone who isn't part of this world, I can be manipulated. Meredith watched her. They're wrong, Victor said simply. Silence. Then Karina's eyes met Meredith's. Not commanding, not questioning, just searching. And in that moment, Meredith knew something without needing to hear it. Karina wasn't afraid of dying. She wasn't afraid of losing power. She wasn't afraid of war. She was afraid of what she would become if she let this fragile, frightening, human thing be taken from her. The decision came slowly, silently, but once spoken, it felt like something that had always been true. Meredith stays, Karina said, not loud but final. Not hidden, not locked away, not treated as weakness. She stays. And anyone who touches her answers to me. It was not a threat. It was something deeper, something like a vow. The others exchanged glances, not questioning her judgment, but accepting a new reality. The queen had something to lose. And that made her more dangerous, not less. That night, Meredith stood alone in the corridor outside the war room, feeling weight settle on her shoulders she had never asked for but could no longer refuse to carry. When Karina approached, she didn't walk like a queen. She walked like a woman who had made a decision she could not undo. Are you angry? She asked quietly. Meredith didn't look away. No, she whispered, but I'm scared. Karina nodded, a soft acknowledgement. Yes, she said. Me too. It was the first time she had admitted it aloud. They walked in silence. Not side by side. Not touching. But close. Just close enough to know they wouldn't walk alone. But danger doesn't knock. It slithers. It waits. It hides behind familiar faces. The attack didn't come at night. It came in the afternoon, when sunlight washed the staircase in warmth and there were flowers by the hall table, and for a moment, life had felt almost normal. Until the glass shattered. Gunshots cracked the air. 3 guards fell before drawing weapons. And for the first time, they weren't aiming for Karina. They were aiming for her. Meredith. Everything happened in seconds. Victor shouted something in Russian. Grant shoved Meredith to the floor. Karina moved faster than human instinct, not toward safety, but toward Meredith. Always toward Meredith. The attackers didn't reach them. They didn't live long enough to try again. But when the gunfire stopped, Karina didn't stand like the undefeated queen. She didn't command. She didn't strategize. She knelt beside Meredith on the marble floor, not breathing, not speaking, her entire posture asking one silent question. Are you alive? And the shake in her hands when she finally touched Meredith's face gave the answer away before Meredith could speak. Yes. Meredith wasn't wounded. But Karina was. Not physically. But in a place no bullet could reach. They're gone, Victor reported. Secure. But Karina didn't look away from Meredith. Not even then. Later, When the floor was clean and guards replaced and silence stretched again, Karina stood alone by the tall glass window, her reflection fractured against the cracks left by the bullet impact, and when Meredith approached quietly, she didn't turn right away. But when she did, her voice wasn't distant or armored or queen-like. It was something else. Something quiet. Something breaking. "I can't protect you by locking you away," she murmured. "I can only protect you by standing between you and whatever tries to reach you." Meredith didn't step closer. Not yet. She let the words sit. Let them breathe. Let them hurt. And then, quietly, simply, honestly, she said, "Then we stand together." Karina closed her eyes. Just for a moment. When she opened them again, nothing was the same. They didn't touch. They didn't speak again. But the silence felt like understanding. And maybe, just maybe, like promise. Karina Rubloff had survived wars, betrayals, ambushes, and the kind of calculated brutality that turned most people into ghosts long before death ever reached them, and yet none of those things had ever made her feel what she felt now, standing alone in her office long after midnight, staring at the city lights flickering beyond the glass, feeling not threatened, not hunted, but exposed, as if every carefully constructed wall she had spent a lifetime perfecting had begun to crack from the inside. Out, not under enemy fire, but under something infinitely softer, something terrifyingly human, something she could not fight. The thought of Meredith being hurt, because the idea of losing her felt like a kind of death that didn't kill the body, but the reason for breathing in the first place. Meredith didn't knock when she entered. She stepped in quietly, as if she already knew Karina didn't want company, but needed it anyway, and when Karina finally turned, it was clear she had not slept, not rested, barely even blinked, her eyes too sharp, too tired, too alive with something she couldn't name and didn't dare to feel, and for the first time, Meredith saw Karina not as untouchable, not as undefeatable, but as unbearably, beautifully human. They did not speak at first. Meredith simply walked across the room, slowly, cautiously, like approaching an animal that was cornered not by force, but by fear of its own freedom, and she stopped just close enough that Karina could feel her warmth, her presence, her steady heartbeat that always seemed to slow things down, to anchor her to earth, to remind her that she was not just built for war, but maybe, impossibly, for something gentler. Karina didn't look at her, but Meredith could see the strain in her posture, the tension in her hands, the way her breath stuttered just slightly when silence became too heavy. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, brittle, too controlled. "I don't lose control," she said, though it didn't sound like pride. It sounded like a confession, and Meredith didn't interrupt, because sometimes the way Karina spoke felt like stitching open wounds back together. "I don't hesitate. I calculate. I win. That is how I have survived. That is how I have kept everyone alive. But today," her voice cracked, just barely. "Today, I didn't think. I ran. I didn't care about strategy. I didn't care about position. I didn't care about anything except reaching you first." Meredith did not smile. She did not soften. She just listened, and something in her listening felt like permission. Karina exhaled shakily, looking down at her hands as if surprised they were trembling. "People can't know I feel that way," she whispered, almost desperately. "Not them. Not anyone. It is not a luxury I can afford. Emotion is not protection. Emotion is ammunition. And the moment they see it, the moment they know," she didn't finish the sentence, but Meredith knew, because she understood now what Karina had been trying so hard not to feel, not because she didn't want to, but because she couldn't afford to. So Meredith did not tell her it was okay. She did not tell her she was safe. She did not tell her she was allowed to feel. She simply told her the only truth that mattered. "You don't have to feel it alone." The silence that followed was thick and fragile, heavy but hopeful, and for a moment, Meredith thought Karina might pull away, might shut down, might force her walls back into place, but she didn't. She looked up, and the expression in her eyes was one Meredith had never seen before in anyone, not even in dying patients, an expression of someone who had never had a safe place to land and was confronted for the first time with the possibility of not falling alone. She didn't cry because Karina Rubloff did not cry, but something in her gaze felt dangerously close to it, and that was more honest, more vulnerable than tears could ever be. Meredith didn't step forward. Karina did. One slow step, then another, until they were standing toe-to-toe, breathing the same unsteady air, and Karina reached out, not urgently, not impulsively, but softly, deliberately, as if she had chosen this, not out of weakness, but out of courage, and she touched Meredith's wrist gently, her fingers trembling like feathers, not from fear, but from the overwhelming relief of finally reaching, finally being allowed to want someone close. Meredith didn't move, didn't rush, didn't hold her, but she lifted her other hand carefully, slowly placing it over Karina's where it rested against her skin, and that simple human contact, so small and delicate, felt like a vow, like a promise, like the most intimate form of saying I am here without ever speaking the words aloud. Karina swallowed hard, eyes locked on Meredith's, and in the softest, most broken voice Meredith had ever heard from her, she whispered, I have never trusted anyone to stay. Meredith didn't promise she would, because promises can break, but she said the one thing that was stronger than promises, stronger than protection, stronger than fear. I'm not leaving tonight. And that, for Karina, was enough. They didn't hug. They didn't kiss. They just stood there, fingers linked, hearts unarmored, and for the first time in Karina's life, silence didn't feel like emptiness, or danger, or strategy. It felt like peace. Outside the window, dawn began to break, washing the sky with the faintest silver light, and for the first time, Meredith saw Karina not just as someone feared, obeyed, or followed, but as someone fiercely, desperately trying to remember how to be human. And maybe, just maybe, she was learning. Not by herself, but together. The house didn't wake with noise, it woke with light, thin streaks of pale gold bleeding slowly through long curtains, spilling into corridors and across polished floors with a softness that felt almost reluctant, as if even the morning was afraid of disturbing something fragile and new that had taken shape in the night. And Meredith, for the first time since arriving, wasn't startled awake by dreams or fear or footsteps in the hall, but simply opened her eyes slowly, peacefully, the early light brushing her face like something gentle, something kind, something that felt almost like belonging. She didn't remember falling asleep, only the touch of Karina's hand on hers, the warmth, the silence, the steadiness, the way they had stood there in her office not as queen and paramedic, not as protector and protected, but as two people learning how to breathe in the same rhythm, and now, in the morning, it wasn't fear that lingered, but something else, something unnamed and calm and dangerously beautiful. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and stepped barefoot into the hallway, her steps slow not because she was afraid of making noise, but because the silence felt sacred, something to protect, something to honor. Somewhere down the corridor, faintly, she heard the soft clink of porcelain, and for reasons she couldn't quite explain, she followed it without hurry, without hesitation, as if her presence there was not an intrusion but an expectation, and when she reached the small sunroom that faced the east garden, she saw her. Karina, standing by the tall windows, hair loose today, not styled, soft, falling over the black cashmere sweater she wore, hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, eyes not sharp and calculating as usual, not scanning for threats, just watching the garden as though for once, for just a moment, she allowed herself not to command but simply to exist. When Meredith stepped closer, Karina didn't turn, but she spoke, her voice low, calm, unguarded. You're awake. Meredith nodded gently and stood beside her, close enough to feel warmth, but not touching, because closeness didn't always require touch. Sometimes presence alone was enough. They watched the garden together in silence. The birds were beginning to stir, faint sounds breaking the stillness, but instead of disrupting the peaceful quiet, they felt like part of it, a reminder that the world could be both dangerous and gentle at once, both cruel and breathtakingly kind. Karina's voice finally slipped through the silence, soft, thoughtful, without command. You're the first person I've ever allowed to see this room in the morning. Meredith didn't answer right away, and when she did, It was just a whisper. Why? Karina didn't look at her. But she also didn't hide. Because morning is when I feel least like who they expect me to be, she said slowly, and Meredith felt it like truth deep beneath the surface, like something Karina hadn't admitted even to herself before now. In the morning, before the phones, before the orders, before the masks, I remember that I am still just a person. And then she turned, and for the first time, there was no mask, no armor, nothing but honesty and exhaustion and vulnerability glimmering beneath her gaze. And you are the only one who has seen me as that person. Meredith didn't touch her. She didn't move closer. She just listened. And Karina, for once, kept speaking. People obey me. They follow me. They fear me. But no one looks at me the way you do. As if I'm allowed to be something other than strong. The light shifted, touching Karina's hair, her face, softer, gentler, and Meredith realized that even the sun seemed different around her now, not because it had changed, but because Karina had allowed it to touch her. Strength isn't just the power to command, Meredith whispered. Sometimes it is the courage to feel. Karina closed her eyes for a long moment, and when she opened them again, it was there. Not weakness, not fear, but a kind of acceptance, the kind that doesn't break you, but remakes you. Stay, she said quietly, not as an order, but as a choice, a plea, a beginning. Just for a little while, before the day begins. And Meredith stayed. They didn't speak much, but when they did, it wasn't about strategy or risk or enemies, it was about small things. How the light always fell warmly on that particular window in early spring. How Karina's mother used to drink tea before the world woke up. How silence could sometimes say more than words ever could. And Meredith told her things too. Not dramatic things, just real things. What it felt like to hold the hand of a patient in an ambulance and know there was nothing more she could do but stay. What it sounded like inside her mind when a siren screamed, but her heartbeat stayed calm. What it meant to her that Karina, feared by so many, somehow felt safer to her than anyone she had ever known. They didn't touch. But sometimes closeness is not in contact. It is in the steadiness of presence. It was peaceful. But peace doesn't erase danger. Only teaches how to breathe in it. When Victor finally approached with morning reports, he paused at the doorway, watching the two women quietly, and there was something like understanding in his eyes, something that recognized the shift not as weakness, but as transformation. Karina acknowledged him with a nod, but didn't step away from Meredith. Not completely. And Victor understood. Karina had not lost her edge. She had sharpened it. Now she wasn't fighting only to defend an empire. She was fighting to protect something human. And that was far more dangerous. Later, as the sun began to warm the stone floors and footsteps beyond the hall signaled the return of routine, Karina looked at Meredith, not with fear, not with desperation, but with something steady, something quietly certain, something that felt like trust. Whatever comes next, she said softly, I don't face it alone. And Meredith, a woman who once thought saving a life meant only patching wounds, now understood. Sometimes saving someone means simply staying. And this time she would. Meredith had seen Karina lead rooms before, but never like this. She had watched her command meetings, dismantle threats, negotiate with ruthless precision and cold logic. But this was different. This wasn't just strategy. It wasn't performance. It wasn't even intimidation. It was surrender, controlled, calculated, but surrender nonetheless. Karina had decided not to hide Meredith anymore. It was subtle at first. Karina didn't dismiss her when Victor entered with updates. She didn't pretend. Meredith wasn't there when discussing intel. She didn't lower her voice or shield her with secrecy. Instead, she deliberately allowed Meredith to hear, to see, to understand. She didn't protect her from her world anymore. She let her into it. Victor noticed first, hesitating before speaking, glancing briefly at Meredith as if checking whether he should continue. Karina didn't say a word, but her silence was its own declaration. Grant noticed next, not surprised, just quietly thoughtful. But it was Elena, the strategist with razor eyes, who said what no one else dared. She can't be here. Her voice calm but sharp. You know what it means if she stays in this room. Karina didn't look away, I know exactly what it means. You're making her a target, Elena warned. She already is, Karina replied. Elena's eyes narrowed. You're confirming it. Karina didn't blink. I'm claiming it. Silence rippled through the room like a fracture. And what do you expect us to do with that? Elena asked, voice low. Protect her as you protect me. Karina said, not loud, but final. And that was it. No one spoke, because there was nothing left to question. That night, the house was too quiet. It was the kind of silence that meant something was coming. Karina stood by the windows, staring at the shimmering city beyond the glass, and Meredith approached quietly, not intruding, but simply being there. Karina didn't turn, but she spoke. They're moving, she said, not with fear, but certainty. Not tonight, but soon. Meredith felt a chill. Karina, if they come for me, they won't come for you. Karina cut in sharply, then softer. They'll come through you, Meredith froze. Not because you're weak, Karina continued, stepping closer, but because you're human, and they don't know what to do with someone who doesn't play by their rules. Her voice shifted. If I could keep you out of this, I would. But you're not just in it anymore, you've changed it. The words didn't feel romantic, they felt terrifying. You don't protect me anymore, Karina whispered. You've steadied me. Meredith didn't speak. She didn't smile. But something in her eyes said, I hear you. Karina exhaled, shaky. I don't remember the last time anyone steadied me. It wasn't a confession of weakness. It was a confession of truth. Slowly, Meredith lifted her hand, placing it gently over Karina's, not pulling, not clinging, just grounding, steady, warm, human. Karina didn't pull away, not this time. Downstairs, Victor was on comms. Movement detected, 36 hours. Maybe less, they're preparing. Do we move her? Grant asked. Victor looked toward the hall where Karina and Meredith stood unseen. No, he said quietly. Where she goes now, Karina goes. Meredith didn't sleep that night. Neither did Karina, but for the first time, neither of them faced the night alone. They didn't run, that was the most shocking thing. They left, yes, because they had to, because the coast was no longer secure, because their safe house had become a target before it ever had a chance to be called that. But they didn't run. When Karina walked out of that mansion, her home, her fortress, her inheritance, she didn't look back, she didn't flinch, she didn't say goodbye, because leaving wasn't defeat, it was evolution. Victor coordinated evacuation with frightening efficiency. Unmarked vehicles, alternate safe routes, coordinated decoys, encrypted comms. Yet despite all the chaos and urgency, nobody rushed Karina, nobody hurried her. They just followed, and Meredith, for the first time, walked beside her, not behind, not shielded, not hidden away, beside her. She walks like she owns the night, Grant whispered to Victor as they crossed the courtyard. She always has, Victor replied. But tonight, he looked at Meredith. Tonight, she walks like she no longer has to walk alone. The safe house was nothing like the mansion. It was smaller, older, hidden inside an abandoned shipping warehouse silently converted into a living space. It had no chandeliers, no marble stairs, no priceless art. It had walls that didn't listen. It had windows you couldn't snipe through. And it had quiet. Too much quiet. For the first hour, Meredith stayed in the lower room, bandaging a guard's shoulder where a bullet had grazed, cleaning blood off her hands with shaking fingers. She pretended were steady. Karina watched her from the doorway. She didn't speak. She just watched. There was a softness in her expression, something tired, something raw, something dangerously close to tender. When Meredith finished and finally met her gaze, Karina didn't ask if she was okay. She asked something far harder. Are you angry? Meredith paused, breathing uneven. I don't know, she admitted. Karina nodded slowly, as if that were the only honest answer. I brought you into this, she said quietly. No, Meredith said, voice steadier. You tried to keep me out of it, but I walked in on my own. Karina looked at her for a long time, silence no longer sharp, not cold, but heavy with meaning. I should have pushed you away, Karina murmured. Meredith held her gaze. You tried, she said. You failed. A shadow of a smile ghosted across Karina's lips, not relief, but recognition. Later, they sat in the makeshift operations room, maps on the table, but strategy had faded. This wasn't about territory anymore, not about money or control. It was about exposure, about being seen, about the danger of letting someone matter. They will come, Karina said softly, handing Meredith a mug of tea. Not for information, not for leverage, not even to kill. Meredith looked at her. Then for what? Karina's gaze didn't waver. To break something they don't understand. Meredith looked back at her. You, she whispered. Karina shook her head gently, her voice soft but certain. No. And this time, she held Meredith's gaze, unflinching, vulnerable. Us. The air stilled. That one syllable changed everything. Later in the night, Meredith left the tense room to breathe. She expected to be alone, but she wasn't. Karina stood by the dusty window, moonlight brushing her face. She looked less like the Mafia queen everyone feared and more like a woman who had finally allowed herself to be afraid, not of death, not of enemies, but of wanting something more than survival. Meredith approached slowly. You're shaking, she whispered. Karina didn't deny it. I know, she said, not ashamed. Meredith hesitated, then did something quietly brave. She took Karina's hand, gently, no rush, no fear, just presence. Karina didn't pull away. This time, she held back, not holding back, holding on. And in that moment, Meredith realized Karina wasn't just protecting her, she was choosing her. Not because she was safe, but because she wasn't. Because Meredith made danger feel survivable, made vulnerability feel livable, made humanity feel worth defending. That night, they didn't run, they didn't hide, they stood side by side, not because they weren't afraid, but because, finally, they were afraid of the same thing, not losing the war, but losing each other, and that was the moment they stopped being two people and became something else. No one remembered hearing alarms, no sirens, no radio warnings, no shouts. They didn't storm in. They didn't attack loudly. They appeared. Victor saw them first. Two vehicles parked just past the floodlights. Engines still warm. Silhouettes too still to be casual. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. He just knew. They're here, he said, but not for Karina, for her. Karina reached the lower corridor just as Meredith turned the corner. There was no panic in Meredith's face. Only something worse. Acceptance, she knew. Don't. Karina whispered. They want me. Meredith said calmly, heartbreakingly calm. They don't need to kill you to win. They only need to show that you can be broken. Karina stepped closer, expression tight, controlled, terrified, not of enemies, not of violence, but of this. You are not leverage, she said through locked jaw. You are not a weakness. You are not. Yes. Meredith interrupted gently. Yes, I am. And then she smiled, soft, devastating. That's the point, Karina. They found the one human thing in your entire world, the one thing you would bleed for, and they're betting you'll either deny it or lose it. Karina didn't flinch, but her voice dropped, dangerously calm. And what do you suggest? That we stop pretending I don't matter. The silence that followed was earthquake level. Karina looked at her then, not like a guarded prisoner or a tragic distraction, but like a choice she had already made, even before this moment, even before the warehouse, even before the first night. She looked at Meredith and let herself be seen. The door behind them buzzed, voices, steps. They didn't come in with guns raised. They came in quietly, carefully, as though approaching something holy. The man in front didn't look like a soldier. He looked like someone who had lost everything once and vowed to never let fear look like weakness again. Karina Rubloff, he said calmly. You know why we're here. I do, she said, but you won't be leaving with anything that belongs to me. Meredith's breath caught. Belongs to me. He looked at Meredith, then at Karina, and for a moment, the entire world seemed to wait for Karina to deny it, to say she's nothing, to say she's no one, to say she doesn't matter. But instead Karina took Meredith's hand and said the most dangerous thing she had ever said. She is mine, and I don't negotiate her. A tremor ran through the room. The man's face fell, not in defeat, but in understanding. She makes you mortal, he whispered. Karina shook her head softly. She makes me human. There are words that start wars, and there are words that end them. This wasn't surrender. It wasn't defeat. It was revelation. The men left without Meredith. They didn't bow, they didn't threaten, they didn't attack, they just left because sometimes the most unstoppable power is choosing not to hide anymore. Later, there was no battle, no final gunfire, no cinematic showdown, just quiet, real quiet. the kind that only comes when something heavy has finally been put down. They sat in the old safe house kitchen, no guards, no maps, no enemies, just two women finally free. Meredith traced the back of Karina's hand with her thumb, slow, unhurried. Memorizing the shape of something she almost lost, Karina didn't speak. She didn't posture. She didn't hide. She just looked at her, like she was trying to learn her by heart. They were never afraid of me, Karina whispered. They were afraid of who I could become if I ever stopped being afraid of feeling. Meredith didn't answer. She didn't need to. She leaned forward and kissed her, not fiercely, not desperately, not frantically, but slowly, like a door opening, like something long overdue. Finally finding its way home, Karina didn't rush to deepen it. She held it, memorized it, then breathed against her lips. I was never afraid of dying, she opened her eyes. I was afraid of being alive. Meredith smiled, soft, certain, and for the first time, Karina Rubloff smiled back, not like a queen, not like a legend, not like someone who had survived everything, but like someone who was finally ready to live. Chicago didn't know when it happened. It didn't happen with fire or war or headlines, but slowly, silently. In the small moments that changed everything, the queen didn't fall. She simply put down her crown, not because she was defeated, but because she didn't need it anymore. Thank you so much for being here and for believing in this channel. If you feel in your heart, you can donate with super thanks so I can focus more and more on this project. Your support helps me keep creating these love stories and bringing them to life for you. See you in the next video.